The Vaelen Empire had stood unbroken for over 10 millennia, its laws etched into the obsidian pillars of the imperial capital and respected across 3 star systems. Generations of diplomats, fierce warriors, and ambitious scholars had all bowed to a singular, unwritten mandate when standing in the presence of the imperial bloodline. Maintain a respectful distance, lower your gaze, and never initiate unprompted contact. The penalties for breaching Vaelen protocol were absolute, ranging from immediate diplomatic expulsion to lifetime exile from the core trade routes, keeping every courtier locked in a perpetual dance of cautious obedience. Yet, protocol was the furthest thing from Commander Julian Vance's mind when he stepped off the transport shuttle and walked into the grand obsidian pavilion of the imperial court. Julian was a human liaison, a representative of a species that the broader galactic community still considered reckless, underprepared, and far too casual for high-stakes interstellar politics. While other alien delegations stood rigidly at attention, whispering frantically behind translated comm links, Julian had spent the past 3 standard hours dealing with broken cargo manifests, a faulty translation earpiece, and a uniform collar that had stubbornly retained a greasy coffee stain from his cramped seat. When he finally reached the center of the vast chamber, he found Princess Lyra standing completely alone upon the grand dais. According to centuries of court tradition, the imperial heirs were sequestered in a halo of absolute authority, where no one spoke unless spoken to and no one dared look an imperial princess in the eye. To the surrounding courtiers, she was an untouchable symbol of divine mandate and military might, a living monument to a 10,000-year-old dynasty. But to Julian, she just looked like someone who hadn't slept in 3 days and was desperately trying to hold a very heavy weight together on her own. Surrounding the dais was a profound, suffocating silence that felt entirely unnatural for a room filled with hundreds of living beings. The natural flow of foot traffic in the pavilion shifted meters before reaching her position, parting like water around a stone without anyone needing to be told. The courtiers, guards, and visiting dignitaries moved through the outer rings of the hall with exaggerated care, their eyes fixed firmly on the floor or their datapads, carefully orchestrating their paths to avoid even casting a shadow toward the royal bloodline. This isolation was not merely a matter of polite distance, it was a psychological and social barrier reinforced by generations of fear, reverence, and rigid institutional dogma. No one ever checked to see if the person beneath the crown was exhausted, lonely, or buckling under the crushing expectations of an immortal empire. The culture had built a fortress of absolute loneliness around its leaders, mistaking enforced isolation for supreme dignity, and demanding that everyone else perpetuate the myth that the royal family needed nothing from anyone. Julian stood at the edge of this invisible boundary, watching the subtle rise and fall of the princess's shoulders as she stared blankly ahead at the empty corridors. His human instincts, forged in a culture that valued connection, community, and standing shoulder to shoulder during crises, screamed against the absurdity of what he was witnessing. To leave someone completely stranded in a crowd of thousands simply because of an ancient rule felt not just archaic, but fundamentally wrong on a deeply human level. Instead of adopting the formal, spine-snapping posture required by Vaelen custom, Julian took a deep breath, adjusted his awkwardly fitting jacket, and decided to take a step forward. He did not care about the cultural friction or the formal observation reports that were undoubtedly already being filed by the station's administrative monitors. His back throbbed from the 31-hour flight in a cargo-class seat, his earpiece buzzed with unresolved complaints, and his mind was entirely uninterested in playing by the rules of a civilization that equated human decency with protocol violation. As he crossed the invisible perimeter, the ambient hum of the court dropped significantly in volume, capturing the collective attention of every sentient being in the room. Some guards instinctively reached for their disruptor pikes, while alien diplomats froze mid-stride, horrified by the sheer audacity of an outsider marching straight toward the imperial dais. Julian kept his eyes fixed forward, ignoring the gasps and the sudden tightening of multi-jointed limbs among the terrified onlookers who expected him to be vaporized on the spot. He stopped just a few paces away from the raised platform, right where the cold obsidian met his worn boots. With a long, weary exhale, he rubbed the back of his neck, letting go of all the professional pretense that had bogged down his first day on the station. He looked up at the princess, recognizing the familiar weight of profound isolation in her eyes, and prepared to do something that would forever alter the diplomatic landscape of the empire. Julian didn't bow, nor did he recite the complex multisyllabic greeting required when addressing an imperial heir of the Vaelen dynasty. Instead, he simply looked at her, let his shoulders drop into a relaxed posture, and offered a normal, tired, genuinely empathetic human smile, the kind your face instinctively makes when you recognize another person who is having an exceptionally long week. It was a facial expression completely devoid of political calculation, subtext, or hidden leverage, carrying only the simple message that she was seen and acknowledged as a living person. The entire hall plunged into a state of absolute, breathless stillness, as if the air itself had been sucked out of the room. Court officials locked up in sheer disbelief, their brains struggling to process how anyone could dare offer a casual facial expression to a 10,000-year-old royal bloodline. Breaking a 10,000-year tradition in front of the sitting imperial lineage with nothing more than a friendly grin was an act of cultural heresy so profound that no handbook had ever prepared the bureaucrats for it. Princess Lyra froze completely, her silver-tinted eyes widening in genuine shock as the traditional cold, unreadable mask of royalty slipped away. For a terrifying, suspended moment, time seemed to grind to a halt in the grand pavilion while everyone waited for the lightning bolts of imperial wrath to strike. The silence stretched thin and tense, vibrating with the collective anxiety of an entire court waiting for a disaster to unfold. Then, slowly, the rigid, militaristic tension in Princess Lyra's shoulders began to dissolve, replaced by a flicker of human-like bewilderment. The bioluminescent markings beneath her silver skin shifted from the cool, defensive white of royal formality to a warm, swirling hue of unexpected curiosity. For 3 long years, everyone had treated her like a monument, a hazard, or a fragile piece of glass, but this strange, tired alien had just walked right up and smiled at her like she was a neighbor passing in a grocery aisle. "You are," she began, her voice cutting through the terrified silence of the court with a sharp, echoing clarity, remarkably unqualified for diplomatic service, "aren't you?" Her tone wasn't laced with anger or royal condemnation, it carried a strange, underlying note of disbelief that caught the surrounding guards entirely off guard. They had their weapons primed, yet the princess was standing there, visibly processing an emotion she hadn't experienced since ascending the throne. "You have no idea," Julian replied smoothly, adjusting his crooked collar and pulling out a battered datapad to check his overdue schedule. "I've got 17 formal complaints waiting on my desk, my earpiece is malfunctioning, and I'm pretty sure your trade ministers communicate entirely in riddles. Got a minute? Someone needs to explain why your logistics department is still using ancient stone tablet encryption." From the back of the observation gallery, Julian's Groovian handler, Pip, buried all 4 of his green-skinned hands straight into his face in absolute despair. Pip whispered frantically into his encrypted comm link, lamenting to anyone who would listen that his career was officially over before lunch. "We are going to start an interstellar war," Pip muttered under his breath, watching in sheer horror as his human charge casually chatted with the most feared and revered royal figure in the entire star system. Around the gallery, alien delegates began whispering furiously among themselves, hastily rewriting their morning reports to account for this unprecedented security breach. The cultural monitors, who had spent decades meticulously documenting the unyielding rigidity of Vaelen traditions, suddenly found their entire academic framework collapsing in real time. A human junior attaché had just bypassed 10 millennia of social engineering with a single grin, and the universe didn't quite know whether to panic or applaud. Yet, despite the mounting panic in the background, neither Julian nor the princess made a move to retreat. Julian stood his ground with the calm, stubborn persistence unique to his species, while Lyra looked down at him with an expression that hovered somewhere between disbelief and profound relief. The invisible barrier of fear and isolation that had surrounded the dais for 3 years was actively cracking under the weight of an ordinary, unscripted conversation. Without waiting for an official invitation or a royal decree, Julian calmly stepped up onto the lower edge of the dais, signaling to the surrounding guards that he wasn't going anywhere anytime soon. He reached into his coat pocket, pulled out a small, foil-wrapped ration bar he'd saved from his dismal transport flight, and casually split it in half. Offering the larger piece toward the astonished princess, he asked the most radical question anyone had dared utter in a decade. "Did you actually get to eat breakfast today, or were you too busy standing here looking majestic?" Princess Lyra stared at the offered food, then up at Julian's face, searching for any sign of mockery, treasonous intent, or hidden manipulation. Finding only genuine, weary hospitality, a rare and genuine tremor of emotion touched her features, melting away the cold exterior she had been forced to wear since her accession. Slowly, deliberately, her silver hands reached out and accepted the ration bar, her fingers brushing against his in a simple, physical connection that violated every single protocol in the Imperial Handbook. The courtiers gasped in unison, creating a wave of collective shock that rippled through the obsidian pillars of the hall. By accepting the food and engaging in a casual, egalitarian exchange on the sacred dais, the princess was effectively dismantling centuries of enforced untouchability right in front of her advisors. Julian didn't flinch at the collective gasp. He just took a bite of his half of the bar, looked around the silent room, and remarked, "You know, the acoustics in here are great, but the air recycling could use a serious upgrade." Within the hour, the emergency council chambers were thrown into utter chaos as high-ranking officials scrambled to address the unprecedented events in the pavilion. The council chair, a towering Aroth with a massive forehead and a voice like rumbling thunder, demanded an immediate explanation for why the imperial protocols had been so flagrantly ignored. They needed to decide whether to charge Julian with cultural subversion, strip him of his diplomatic credentials, or quietly sweep the incident under the rug to avoid international embarrassment. Yet, as the holographic playback of the interaction played across the central display, the tone in the room began to shift subtly. Several delegates who had initially called for Julian's immediate imprisonment found themselves quietly watching the way the princess's posture had completely relaxed after he shared the food bar. They saw a young leader who had been slowly suffocating under the weight of her own empire's traditions, finally breathing fresh air for the first time in 3 long years. Julian was summoned before the full council layer that afternoon to answer for his actions, walking into the grand circular chamber with his stained uniform still unpressed. When the chair sternly asked him what gave him the right to shatter 10 millennia of sacred imperial protocol on his very first day, Julian didn't flinch or offer a polished, diplomatic deflection. He simply looked the council members in the eye and said that treating a lonely person like a living statue wasn't a tradition worth preserving. Before the council could pass a formal judgment or issue a heavy sentence against the human attaché, the heavy chamber doors slid open with a sharp hiss. Princess Lyra walked into the center of the circular room, moving with the same undeniable grace and poise that commanded the respect of an entire empire, but this time, the cold, untouchable wall of isolation was entirely gone. She didn't stand at a distance, she walked straight to the center dais, turned to face the stunned council, and took her place right beside Julian. In a clear, ringing voice that commanded absolute silence across the chamber, the princess addressed the gathered delegates with words that would reshape Vaelen history forever. She declared that the 10,000-year-old tradition of forced isolation had not honored her family's legacy, but had merely turned her throne into a cage of silent suffering. She thanked the human diplomat not for breaking the law, but for having the simple, courageous empathy to ask if she was okay when everyone else was too terrified to look. The council members sat in stunned silence, realizing that no amount of bureaucratic rules or ancient legal codes could override the powerful truth of her words. The Aroth chair slowly lowered his documentation, exchanged a long look with the other delegates, and officially concluded the review with no censure and no penalties. The rigid walls of the empire had finally been breached, not by war or political leverage, but by the stubborn, unstoppable power of human compassion. By the following week, the atmosphere aboard Vareth 9 and within the imperial capital had undergone a profound and irreversible transformation. The obsidian pavilion no longer felt like a cold monument of untouchable authority, but a living, breathing space where diplomats, courtiers, and royal figures could actually talk to one another as equals. The automatic rerouting of foot traffic around the princess had completely stopped, replaced by genuine nods of greeting and an open, welcoming community spirit. Julian sat at the edge of the palace gardens on a bright morning, sipping a cup of warm, surprisingly decent tea, while waiting for his usual breakfast companion to arrive. Pip stood nearby, no longer hyperventilating into his comms, having finally accepted that his human charge's chaotic brand of diplomacy was actually changing the galaxy for the better. The coffee stain on Julian's collar was still there, completely permanent and utterly ignored by everyone who passed by. As Princess Lyra walked down the eastern corridor toward him, moving with a light, unburdened step and a warm gold-tinted glow beneath her silver skin, Julian smiled his familiar, tired, genuine smile. She sat down across from him, took her cup of tea, and looked out over the sprawling interstellar gardens with a peaceful look in her eyes. Without missing a beat, Julian raised his cup and said the words that had started it all, "Same time tomorrow." If you like the video, make sure to like and subscribe my channel.